Okay, let's get started because we do have a lot to cover this morning. We've got lots that we want to talk about, and so there is a fair bit there. We're going to try and keep our sort of speaking bit to 45 minutes or under, which means that we'll probably be speaking quite quickly. Please do, if you have any questions as you go through, put them in the Q&A tab, which you should see there, and we'll sort of collate them and answer as many as we can at the end. If we do run out of time and any are unanswered, then what we'll do is either come back to you via email. There will be a recording of the webinar, and we can also share the deck as well. And if there's anything that you've sort of thought about afterwards, just feel free to ping me or Lee on LinkedIn or emails if you've got them, and we'll come back to you as soon as we can. So without further ado, we're going to be talking today about Google Analytics 4 and how to use it a bit better. And how to understand it a little bit better. Hopefully, yeah. So my name's Jake. I live here in Calgary, Canada, and I lead our North American ops. I am quite skeptical about GA4. The first few times I've logged in and tried to use it, it's kind of given me a headache because it hasn't had all of the stuff that I'm used to with Universal Analytics, which I've been using for more than a decade. But my colleague here, Lee, he's based in Norwich in the UK. And Lee, you've been doing a lot more work on GA4 and you like it more than I do, right?
Yes, I think it's safe to say that.
Yeah, well, hopefully you're going to persuade me by the end of this that it's not as catastrophic as I think. So essentially with this, I'm going to be playing the sort of skeptical person. Lee's going to be trying to persuade me why GA4 is better than I think it is. So he'll be basically doing all the technical talking and I'll be asking devil's advocate questions as we go along. So GA4, obviously, we had the announcement a couple of years ago. Hopefully by now, everybody who's listening in has got it sort of at the very least installed on the site and configured and has sort of had a little poke around in it. We're not going to do, we're going to try and avoid doing the thing that every webinar has been doing, like, hey, you should install Google Analytics and set up a couple of events. So anyway, when it's been released, Google Analytics 4 is not very popular so far. Here are some tweets that I found. If you're on Twitter and you're into PPC, hashtag PPC chat is a good place to hang out. And some of these quotes are, they're from pretty serious, digital marketing people. John Kagan is in New York. He runs a pretty good, big paid media team with some big clients. And I really love this quote because I basically agree with more or less everything he says. I mean, performance racks, maybe, but I hate GA4 almost as much as I hate PMAX. Lack of transparency in local campaigns, Bing changing their name to Microsoft Advertising. And this is probably most important for me. Anyone who tries to call Facebook Meta in my presence, I just won't do it. However, so a lot of people are skeptical. Lee, you'd put this graph together in terms of a learning curve for it. Most things, right? And I'm probably at the bottom left.
Yeah, that's right. I think really what it comes down to is we're all very busy and we were happy with the original and the way things were. And we don't want to learn something new because we haven't got time for that, just because Google says so. But I think it's worth it. And when you become more familiar with it, you probably like it more.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to, right? And I think the point you made yesterday, it's like when the Google Ads interface changed 4 or 5 years ago. And at first, everybody hated it. And actually, now, I can't even barely remember what the old one looked like. So I would say that over the last few years, if you're a marketing person, I mean, all right, it's probably been more stressful if you've been a ER surgeon. But in general, I think it's been quite stressful because we've had to consider iOS 14 messing up Facebook ads. We've got Google Analytics saying they're changing. Cookies are going away, so remarketing is going to become even weirder. And then we've had the stuff that everybody else has had, pandemic, quasi-recession. We've got AI coming our way. That's a quote in the bottom left. Am I going to need to be doing a plumbing course in 3 years? No, I don't think I will. Actually, when you look at the stats, digital marketing is less exposed than plumbing to AI in terms of job threat, according to, it was McKinsey or Deloitte or somebody. But nevertheless, there's lots there. And then we've got to think about this whole new product and we're busy anyway. So it's Christ. So we're going to jump through a few of the sort of primary things that we, the things that have been annoying to me and the things that I have seen other marketers get frustrated with. And Lee is essentially going to explain why they are not as bad as I thought. So let's start off. as we know, there's been a big focus on privacy and all of that good stuff, like looking after user data. And Google Analytics has sort of been under fire. This has been a trend. The privacy has been more and more prominent, really, since potentially Ed Snowden, Cambridge Analytica, all of this kind of stuff. And so, the question is GA4 spying on people? Does GA4 do much to fix that? And are we going to get into hot water? So, Lee, I know you've got some sort of really good stuff to show here. We're going to talk through how does GA4 affect data collection and privacy compliance? Is GA4 more privacy compliant than UA was? What's the difference in how it collects data on users? And we're going to talk about that throughout the whole session here. What does that mean for users? What's that mean for you if you're a business owner or a marketing manager? What do we need to do to prepare? Will it necessitate how we need to look at our privacy policies? And then where do we look under the hood? So Lee, I'll pass over to you now because I know you've got sort of a few things to chat through.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So we're going to jump right into this with some heavy stuff. A few minutes on GDPR and privacy. A few cases have been brought to court, and the courts have ruled against Google. This is because IP addresses can be considered as personally identifiable information. IP addresses of people in the European Union were transferred to the US, and according to US law, the data of EU citizens can then be accessed by American security services. So even though this has apparently never happened, it's theoretically possible. The latest on the situation is when users are located in the European Union, data is now sent to Google's European servers. Whilst old analytics collected IP addresses and made them inaccessible, GA4 now just discards IP addresses altogether. These features are both automatic, so you don't have to do anything. And subsequently, Google claims that GA4 is now fully GDPR compliant. Although I will say there are several settings in GA4 to check, perhaps with your GDPR compliance officer. GA4 does allow a lot more control over your privacy options, though. So let's take a look. Next slide, please. Oh, Jake is on it today.
Playing your gig already, mate. So yeah, we can always play.
So this is how we're accessing Google privacy controls. You go to admin, data settings, and data collection. And we can see that some settings here are configurable by region, which is a new feature. There are three core settings here. Firstly, Google Signals, which is disabled by default. This allows cross-device reporting and cross-device conversions, and also some demographic data, which are all very handy for marketing. It works by using data from a user's Google account, which they consent to when they create their Google account. The second one is granular location and device data, which is what it says on the tin. This is enabled by default, and just like Signals, we have the option to enable or disable this on a country-by-country basis. If you do decide to disable granular location, it will impact some of the new conversion modeling capabilities.
Sorry, I've jumped ahead. That's my fault. I just my hand slipped on the mouse. Sorry. There we go.
No worries. So I've lost my train of thought.
Oh no, my fault.
Yeah, it's all right. Basically, if you disable the granular location, it will inhibit some of GA4's functionality. It's not going to be able to fill in the gaps so much for its modeling capabilities, which is another big plus. But modeling is a whole other story. The last point here is ads personalization. This is disabled by default, and it allows you to send your shiny new GA4 audiences to Google Ads. If Signals is also enabled, the two options combine and allow you to use cross-device remarketing, which is really cool. But a quick disclaimer from us, like we aren't legal experts, so we can't give you legal advice. I'm sharing these 3 points with you so you're aware of them, and you could speak to your legal team about updating website privacy policies in line with these features. The core thing, though, is that having so much control over these 3 things is a huge win for GA4. And now, Jake, if we would like to proceed to the
Yeah,
next
okay.
slide. So this is a slight tangent. There's a reason for it, though. So GA4 closely integrates with the Google tag, and that's the code on your website that powers GA4. It allows you to use one single website tag across all of your Google products if you so choose to. You can access and manage the tag settings from inside GA4, which is very useful, although it is a little bit buried. We like this because you can also use the same tag to send data to multiple Google properties. So you could use one tag and send data to another GA4 property or Google Ads accounts. This is also a nice workaround for when you're used to using multiple views from the older analytics.
Yeah, that's something that I've found weird, is not having views.
Yeah. So hopefully this will help. And on the next slide, we're going to take a look at a new privacy related feature from the Google tag called user provided data. So they're a bit buried. If you were to, yes, play, please, and head over to admin, and then we're going to go into data streams. We're going to load up our stream and head over to configure tag settings. From here, you then go into user provided data. Now, currently, this feature only works with Google Ads, and it will work when you add Google Ads as a destination to your Google tag, hence the previous slide. This is a feature that basically helps you log more conversions, another topic for another time. But I'm raising it because this is enabled by default. So even though it's currently only available for Google Ads, there have been murmurings that this feature could expand into GA4's conversion measurement. So it's good to be aware of this feature now so you can manage your settings and website privacy policy accordingly. And then over to Jake for the next slide.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the main thing that I'm seeing here is, I know there were a few bits in, old analytics, UA, where you could do this, but the thing that strikes me here is the configurability. So that, because it's different, right? You probably need to worry about this. Like if you're a small business in North America, well, you don't need to care so much about GDPR. So you can probably do more of this. Whereas if you're functioning, like let's say your business is in Austria or Germany or somewhere like that, well, actually you're able to configure your settings to, be as compliant as possible with the sort of local legislation, and essentially makes sure you're not being too sneaky. And it's that balance really between practicality and precision as a marketer versus respecting privacy, and it's sort of always an interesting balance. But yeah, I mean, obviously, that's super useful with Google Signals. I mean, it sounds really cool, and I am quite excited about Google Signals plus the cross-device remarketing as a sort of marketing bod. That does sound pretty handy. Now, on to the next thing that I have been seeing that kind of is often related, right? Like in terms of if we're sort of setting our privacy settings in a certain way. Well, I've often found when I first sort of have a GA4 instance set up, well, I'm looking at my CRM data and I'm looking at my my Universal Analytics data, my ad platform data, and then GA4, and none of them are consistent with each other. And that, like, it's like, well, what should I be looking at? What should my source of truth be here? Because typically, in terms of marketing, like marketing campaign performance, sure, I've used CRM data to measure final sales, but in terms of sort of what's happening on the web, I've always used Universal Analytics as a source of truth. So when it's not matching up against GA4, I'm like, well, is this right? I don't know. Is it adding up? I know that attribution models are a bit different, and one thing that I always liked in Universal Analytics was that tool that you could use to compare the different attribution models to sort of show which marketing channels have been useful for which stages of the user journey. But when we are seeing those inconsistencies, I guess my question is, how do I know that's because GA4 is just a bit different? And how do I know if I've messed up the setup? And then, what steps are there to troubleshoot, I guess, would be where I'd want to get into it, essentially. So again, over to you, Lee. I mean, this is one that has bugged me. So I am curious to see what you're saying.
Yeah, no, hopefully I can help, Jake. And yeah, I think a lot of people get concerned when they're trying to compare the old and the new. The truth is the way that GA4 collects data is fundamentally different from the old analytics. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's not supposed to match up, but it should be similar.
Mhm.
The new way of collecting data is better because it's much more flexible. And the idea is that the data you send to GA4 is more bespoke and more aligned to your website and your marketing goals. As for comparing analytics to CRM data, well, the CRM should always be collecting more data than analytics. And this is
Mhm.
because essentially more websites are one way or another blocking tracking more and more.
Mhm.
So analytics should receive less data than the CRM. And so, yeah, the short answer is it's not matching up because GA4 data is different and arguably better sometimes. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more on the following slides.
Yeah, when I see it, I'll believe it, Lee, and but you'll persuade me, I'm sure.
Okay, so one difference is how conversions or goals are counted. This image represents conversions, but I want to first talk a little bit about events. Every signal that your website sends to GA4 is called an event. GA4 counts every single event without deduplicating it. So let's say your website sends a signal every time someone clicks on your phone number, although it could be any action. If your user clicks on that phone number 4 times in one visit, then that's 4 events that GA4 records. Old analytics would deduplicate that in a metric called unique events, but GA4 just doesn't have that. Here's the kicker. This is why it's relevant. Conversions, which is the new word for goals. In GA4, any event, like your phone click, can be easily marked as a conversion, which is really cool in itself. But in GA4, you could experience multiple phone clicks for a single user visiting your site. And this would inflate the number of conversions reported in GA4 compared to the old analytics. That's because in the old analytics, it would have only recorded a single goal instead of 4 conversions. But GA4 is still in development, which is a bit bad because it means it's not quite finished, but it's also quite good because Google are actively solving problems and making improvements. For example, it was only 2 weeks ago that GA4 introduced the solution to this very problem. You can now count conversions only once per session, thus solving our problem with multiple phone clicks. So
Yeah.
let's take, oh, sorry, Jake.
And I can see that because like sometimes you'll have like I see this more on screen recordings if I'm on a Hotjar, but for example, you see an element on a page and people click on it 3 or 4 times, right? Because either it's not loading quickly or it's just for whatever reason it's not responsive enough. But if you're trying to measure, if you want to measure how efficient your marketing campaign is at driving a conversion, you don't want it to measure 4 times. So yeah, this is definitely really handy.
Well, on this slide, if you press play, we'll just describe how you can access this option. Yeah, to access this screen, we're basically going to navigate to the conversions page. So you hit admin in the bottom left, head over to conversions, and then you can control this individually for each individual conversion or event. It's really just as simple as that, which is great and a great example of how Google are continuing to work on this new platform.
And again, yeah, like that's one where, for example, you might log in without realizing. I didn't even realize they were duping conversions, right? So you might log into that and go, well, why are my conversions so inflated compared to? Well, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. All right.
Great. Well, this is actually a biggie next. So there are yet more reasons why your data is not matching up, and users is one of them. So old analytics focused heavily on sessions, but GA4 focuses more on users instead, which I think is great because it makes a lot of sense. We should be more interested in the activity of users across all of their visits. But the thing that will slip under the radar for a lot of marketers is when you look at GA4 reports, there is a users metric. In old analytics, the default user metric was total users, but in GA4, the default is active users. So to be clear, the new default user metric in GA4 is active users, not total users. So when you see a metric called users in GA4, it's probably referring to active users. I need to stop saying the word users.
Yeah, that's yeah. So that would essentially like increase your conversion rate, because if old analytics is just counting everybody, whereas new analytics only counting people who are engaged, you can have fewer. So that would sort of boost your conversion, or stuff like that, versus what you might have seen on the previous analytics, right?
Yeah, so if you're looking at conversion rate per user and there are fewer users than sessions, then yeah, that would increase your conversion rate. Incidentally, a user is considered active if it's either their first visit or that they've triggered another event after loading the page. And you can still see the total users in GA4, but you'll need to use explorations, which we'll come to later. Another difference is data retention settings. And that's another one that can go unnoticed. But the default in GA4 is just 2 months, but you can increase it to 14 months. So with the default settings, the same user could visit your website twice, but maybe 3 months apart, and GA4 will see that as 2 different users. The old analytics had a retention which was set to 14 months, like as the minimum. So it's worth having a look at the settings and making sure that you're happy with them. For us, we like 14 months because
I mean, clearly you want to
it?
know 2 months is quite short, and especially if you're looking at B2B, right, where you've got buying cycles that might be 6 months. Well, it's just not going to tie things together. I mean, I get why they've done it because they're under so much privacy fire, but and 2 months evaporates very quickly, so yeah.
Exactly.
I'm surprised that 14 months is the top. I wonder if that will be changed. So let's go ahead. Yeah, this video hasn't crashed us again.
That's good. So yeah, to access this, you're going to go to admin, data settings, and data retention. And then it's right there. You can select the data retention settings, which is of course going to impact the number of users and how it's tying users together. So next slide, please.
Yeah, I just put in a silly meme because I thought we'd break up the technical stuff.
Yeah, and thanks for staying with this so far. We're halfway through this second section, but if you'd believe it, there are yet more differences in measuring in different numbers and things. So
yeah,
GA4 has some really cool attribution models, and these can be applied to your standard reports. An attribution model is essentially the rules that assign credit to a certain digital channel, like organic, for example, for generating a conversion. And this is important because users are making more and more visits to your website before converting or doing the thing that you want them to do. In all of the default reports, the attribution model in old analytics was a special kind of last click called last non-direct click. But in GA4, the default attribution model is data-driven. In a very brief roundabout way, a data-driven attribution model looks at all of the interactions that a single user had and all the pages that they visited, and then compares this to all the other users and pages and paths that all the other users took before they converted. It essentially means that a single conversion could be split into pieces and spread across different channels. So organic might get half a conversion, direct a quarter, and affiliates a quarter. Whereas old analytics didn't give you the full picture, GA4 in this way is better at giving you actionable data that you can use to help identify where channels are maybe underperforming, and therefore help you to move budgets around and get better returns on your marketing spend.
This is always the client question where, and I like this because Google, it means like what we will do as default in Google Ads is set our conversions to data driven. And so you would have that disparity because old analytics was last non-direct click. And then if you've got your goal settings in Google Ads to data driven, there's going to be a disparity. But then you get clients who are going, well, why do I have 3.72 conversions? What's 0.72 of a conversion? And then you kind of have to explain
it's
this
the way
stuff,
that's splitting it all up, isn't it? But yeah, with GA4 you then get this multi-channel data driven, which is great.
Yeah,
there is a attribution comparison report, which
Cool.
you
Yeah,
can
I love this.
access in this way. It's under the advertising section of GA4. And then if you were to click on model comparison, and much like UA, this lets you compare different models, and it's also nice and customizable. In GA4, you can also choose the models that are used in your reports, which we're going to cover on the next slide.
Yeah, and one thing and I think somebody might have asked this question as well, Lee, like I know they're deprecating a couple of attributions models, right? Which I think they're getting rid of first click, aren't they? Which I'm annoyed by.
Yeah, more and more they're trying to move towards data driven, because it's more based on the statistics of all of your users and identifying patterns there. So I like data driven. It's just a hard one to explain.
I get the logic of it. I mean, it's essentially, using machine learning and like big data to sort of, we used to use position based a lot, right? Where you give some, but I do like being able to use first click, for example, to be able to say, right, here are the marketing channels by which people first interacted. Like, and that'll often be like your YouTube or your programmatic or organic social even, right? But then you can't, it doesn't enable you to say, look, here's how people, they may not have ever converted or, but here's, I know that data driven still gives some credits to it, but anyway.
Yeah, there's certainly a usage scenario for things like first click, but what data driven is trying to do is take that into consideration as well. It's almost like combining everything and saying, well, is that first interaction actually the most important one based on the ways that everyone else has been interacting with the website?
Yeah, fair enough. So you're going to show how to change the actual default model, right?
Yeah, so another big plus of GA4 is that you can change the attribution model for your standard reports. Its default is data-driven. You can change this by navigating to attribution settings in admin, and then quite easily you can select which one you want to use for your standard reports. And another cool thing about this is that it will be applied to your existing data, which is pretty exciting and very cool, because normally everything is that you don't get that kind of thing in analytics. It likes to not apply stuff to previous data.
Yeah, that's cool. That is helpful. So Lee, we're at 3:30 your time, so we do need to sort of move along quite quickly, I think. So let's head through.
Of course. This next one, thresholding, which is quite important, and you may have seen it in some of your reports already. It's represented by this red exclamation triangle sign. So what's this about? There's a setting in GA4 called reporting identity, where you can define how GA4 works out how to link different visits or sessions to a single user. And if you use Google Signals within the reporting identity, then in order to protect the user's privacy, thresholding will be applied to your reports. So what does this actually mean? You need to have a minimum number of users in like a given row of your report for a given metric, or it could be completely removed from your report altogether. So if you have less than 50 or so users in a section of your report, so maybe from your email campaign, then that row could be removed by thresholding and your email campaign won't show up at all. So of course, when data is omitted, that can impact your comparison with the old analytics. You can control the settings for reporting identity, which will help remove thresholding, but it comes with a price. Since it relates to Google Signals, you'll get less cross-device tracking, which means that can impact the number of users. And that, I believe, brings us towards the end of this section.
Yes. So yeah, and so I think what you want to do is, if you are seeing that disparity in data, like go through some of these steps in terms of looking at, have you got any reports that have been thresholded? Are your attribution models matching up? Is your data retention, for example, shorter so that you might be losing data there? Are your, duplications being, are your conversions being duplicated, which would inflate your conversion? I think if you go through some of those steps and, like make those changes, some of which, as Lee pointed out, are retroactive, then you can start to see, okay, well, given taking those things into account, is the data still mismatching? If it's still miles off, I would say that you need to troubleshoot how you've got your goals set up, right? Like, and how you've got your data streams set up and things like that.
Yeah, which is a whole other topic.
Yeah, let's
Debugging
not open, and that might be another session of like, but let's not open that kind of worms right now. I know that we do have a couple of questions in. I will come back to those in at the end. But yeah, let's move on. So events are now everything within GA4, right? And I thought I was getting a job in digital marketing back in the day, and now, and I'm not very good at event management because I'm really disorganized. So you know, and the thing, like, the nice thing about digital marketing, especially with ads, is you can turn them off if you've messed them up. If you've forgotten to order a widget that you need to have for an event, and you forgot to order it 2 months ago, you can be in deep trouble, I say, speaking from bitter experience. So so let's talk about events. Everything now is an event, which is quite different, right, to what we had previously in Universal Analytics. Now, how does, again, like, you know, my question is, how does this affect how we're pulling data and managing it? I know that when I've been setting up Google Analytics myself for clients, you know, you've got those baked in events, which is quite handy, actually. It means that you don't need to set up a few bits and bobs. But then I guess, which kind of events are in there? Which ones would you say need to be custom built? Is GTM still the way to do this? Like, so by GTM, I'm assuming everybody here knows, but Google Tag Manager, I don't mean go to market. We have so many 3-letter acronyms in our industry that they've started to like duplicate themselves, right? A bit like conversions. And so, yeah, so I mean, Google Tag Manager, obviously. And then, like, the thing that I was finding really weird and confusing was parameters. And I think it's because I was watching a video done by a very clever chap and like looking, and I was just trying to do a thank you goal. I was literally trying to do a like, hey, form complete thank you goal. It wasn't, the native one wasn't working. And so I was trying to set it up myself. And like, I got into like this whole brain mess around parameters, and I don't know, it seems to be working, but I probably did it wrong. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this. So
yeah, of course. Well, this is one of my favorite sections, actually. And before we dive too much into this tag, I just want to reiterate that an event is a signal that's sent from your website to analytics. Old analytics had 4 different types of signals. 3 of them were pretty rigid, and the 4th one was slightly less rigid. Whereas, as you say, GA4 has 1 type of signal, which is really flexible, and it opens up like this whole new world that could potentially blow your mind. But this is also why you should make an effort to start fresh with GA4 with new events instead of trying to replicating the old analytics, because you could be missing out on some really good new GA4 features. Now, yes, you've pointed out that several events come baked in with GA4 without you having to do anything, thanks to a feature called enhanced measurement. After installing like one GA4 tag, a website owner can immediately take advantage of several events listed here that are detected automatically. Whilst this is really cool, it might not work for everyone. So something to be aware of is to make sure that you test these out thoroughly and make sure that you're getting the expected data through. So to recap, you install one tag and then you get all of these events automatically. Where it gets interesting, though, is all websites are different and all businesses are different. And there's different goals. They have different ways of measuring success. So why should you stick with the same basic template as everyone else? And why would you want to? And that's why you have 2 more types of events called recommended events and custom events. There are many ways to set these up, which, again, apologies, could be a whole nother session by itself. I recommend Google Tag Manager, but you can install them directly from your website's code. And you can also create and manage events from inside GA4 itself. There are over 30 different recommended events. Some good examples are purchase, add to cart, share, and select content. The idea is that you use what's relevant to you and your business. There's a ton of documentation online from Google on this. But then if you want to track something that's not on the recommended list, you can literally make it up. You can create a new event and call it almost anything you want. Let's say, for example, you're interested when someone clicks on this big green button on your website. You could create an event called CTA click or link click CTA or, you know, green button click, anything like that.
I would call it big green button click.
Big green button click. Yeah, that is clearly the most scalable name. As long as it's under 40 characters and it's lowercase and it has no special characters, then you can send that into GA4 and it'll automatically start logging it. This next slide, we're going to look at how you can access and manage the baked in events. So please do play, Maestro.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I clicked on play and then it went forward a slide for me. So there you go.
So right, so in admin section, you're going to head over to data streams and then select your data stream. And then the first thing there is how to configure these baked in enhanced measurement events. If you do have issues with one, it's nice and easy to disable them. So on to our next slide.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite slides.
Oh yeah.
Parameters. So remember,
this is the bit that confused me, right? So I'm interested to hear.
Every event is a signal, and every time that thing happens on your website, a signal sent to GA4. So every page view, button click, etc. Every event contains some extra information, such as like what page you are on when the event happened. But by itself, the event can be a little bit vague because it has no depth. And we could add richness to our events, which is where parameters come into play. So imagine events as being plates and the parameters as being food on the plates. Now, without parameters, if you weren't measuring parameters, you could tell me that you have plates and you can count the number of plates that you have, and you can even tell me which table the plates are on. But you can't tell me what's on the plate. Parameters add food to your plate. So maybe some pasta, some bolognese, salt and pepper, and how much pasta, how much salt and pepper, is basil included?
I love me a food analogy. Like I use restaurant analogies all the time to explain things.
The purchase event is a good example of this because you have a single purchase event, but it contains parameters like the value of the order, the currency, and the items that were purchased. And just like custom events, you can add custom parameters too. So like if you're selling tickets, you could add a parameter for adults and a parameter for kids. And then you could use GA4 to tell me kids tickets were sold, or which is useful for reporting to your seniors, or maybe even remarketing to families. You don't have to use parameters. So that's another key thing. I think people feel like they have to, but hopefully you can see that it's better if you do, as long as you're putting the right things, as long as you're adding richness to that event. When you use a parameter that already exists in the Google documentation, you might find that your standard reports automatically become a little bit richer with some more information. But if your website is sending custom parameters that are not in the documentation, then you have to define those events in GA4. If you don't, GA4 will just ignore your lovely new parameters. And on the next slide, please, we'll look at how to create one. Cool. So if we press play, we'll see that it's nice and easy. You navigate to admin and then custom definitions. Now here you can select metrics or dimensions. Metrics are basically something that can be added up. You enter your parameters, save it, and away you go. You don't have to define events, but you do have to define parameters. And then after you define a parameter, on the next slide, please, we'll see one in action. So we're going to head over to a standard report for an event called page view. And on here, we're going to see a really simple custom parameter that enhances this page view event with extra information. So at the bottom here, we can see that page header has been included, which is a custom parameter that we're sending with a page view event. But this could be any parameter. And because it's been defined, they'll automatically appear in these reports, which is, super useful at giving you extra visibility on how people are using your website. And then Jake, I will hand back over to you.
Yeah. So that's cool. And like, I know that so you're going to have that tile there under your events report. But then if you want to make it look prettier, you're probably going to have to do that via explorations or a custom report or something like that, right? Like
Yeah,
rather
exactly.
than just a bar graph. Yeah, cool. All right. No, and so what this is shown to me, and like I am, since we've been talking about this, obviously we've practiced a couple of times, like the configurability of all of this is amazing. I think like that's what I really like, is there's a whole bunch of flexibility with GA4. I think that Universal Analytics kind of sent you in a very specific direction, whereas GA4 is like, you can go in any direction. You need to figure out, you just need to sort of have some strategy of where you need to go, and then you can probably configure it towards that. So yeah, like with events, you know, we've got the baked in events. You can set up all kinds of different events, and you can add those additional parameter-led layers to your events, which is really, really handy when you think about, you know, for example, I've got loads of B2B clients, and they might have, okay, we've got a form completion, but you've got fields within that form completion of different, like, how big is your company? How many employees do you have? What's your revenue? Which you can then sort of bake into your events. And so that I'm actually, I am quite interested in that. And I do think, yeah, Google Tag Manager, again, will be our friend. So, okay, I know that GA4 reporting is meant to be very fancy and customizable. When I go in, the first time I logged in, I was like, great, I'm going to go and look at my source medium report, because that is like my bread and butter report. Where the heck was it? It wasn't there. I was like deeply disappointed. And my first view of the reporting in GA4 was I didn't like it. And I tried to make a few explorations. They didn't work. Probably, I don't know why. Like maybe it was, you know, on that, like the data wasn't set up properly. There was sort of too few users or something like that. But my view was, I'm just going to throw Simba off a cliff. So, okay, let's talk about reporting. So why have they got rid of all the reports that we know and love? I mean, I know we maybe didn't use all of them, but like, yeah.
Yeah,
How
I think,
customizable? Yeah.
yeah, hopefully it's starting to make a bit more sense now that we've
Yeah.
seen that the foundations are so customizable. Plus,
Exactly.
I mean, there were loads of reports in Universal Analytics, and probably most of us didn't use 80% of those, but sure, we probably do miss some of that remaining 20%. So if we were to head over to the next slide, now this is the last section, guys, so thanks for bearing with us. There is a bugbear of mine that I first of all want to share with you. Some of the old metrics were just not reliable. And I know that metrics like bounce rate and session duration were attractive, but actually they weren't telling you what you thought they were.
Bounce has always been deeply misleading. I'd always get clients going, oh, it's got a really high bounce rate. I'm like, I don't care about bounce rate. I care about conversion. Like, you know, and actually it's doing its job. If people go like, right, this isn't for me, and go away, or they convert, I'm happy with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, engagement metrics do have their place, but it's important to understand them correctly. So
Yeah.
for awareness activity or something like that. But like take the bounce. So a bounce is measured when someone visits your page and they didn't trigger any further actions on that page. So they could arrive on your page, engage with the content, you know, read it all, and then just leave. That's a bounce. But what if someone arrives on your page, maybe they do carry out an action, but you haven't set up a tracking to measure it, then it's still a bounce. And then there's average session duration. And if you really drill into how it's calculated, it can be quite surprising. So for starters, the duration of anyone who bounces isn't included in average session duration. They could be on there for like 3 minutes on one page, not included. That is unless you have a very specific setup. Analytics also doesn't know how long you spend on the last page of your visit, so that's not included either. So yeah, I mean, some of these are still in GA4 tackles these in a different way. So let's move on to the next slide.
They use engagement rate, right?
Yeah, so bounce rate has been replaced by engagement rate, which is literally the inverse of bounce rate. If bounce was 20%, then the engagement rate would be 80%. It's just upside down. However, since GA4 is tracking more events, this metric is more reliable. So like when a user scrolls to the bottom of the page, thanks to those baked in events, this is automatically measured and the user is no longer bouncing. They are considered engaged. And old analytics didn't do that, which is a marked improvement.
Because they're doing this at a page level, so this wouldn't include, or it's doing, would it include page depth, for example, if you're looking at a user visiting a site? I know we sort of started to talk about this yesterday, and I think it was a big point, wasn't it?
So page depth is, the number of pages someone visits within a session. And when I last tried accessing it, I could see it in some places, but I couldn't access it directly, which was a frustration. But of course, it is still in development as a platform. Maybe page depth will come. Otherwise, you can implement a bespoke solution. The other thing is average session duration, though, which that does still exist in GA4, but it is calculated a bit differently, and this makes it a bit more reliable than in the old analytics.
Thumbs up to that, because it's a useful metric if it's accurate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just understanding what goes into these metrics.
Gotcha.
So, reporting. As an agency, we like third-party reporting because you can make reports look nice and pretty. If you're an advertiser, you've of course got the choice between a third party or going directly to the source. But one important thing to remember is if you can't access the data in GA4, a third party platform isn't going to fix that. You also can't access it in a third party platform. There is sometimes, though, a sneaky advantage to using a third party, but it's not always available. GA4, unfortunately, contains certain limitations called API quotas. You get an hourly allowance and a daily allowance for the number of data requests that you can make to populate your third-party report. And it can be quite restrictive, especially if you've got a lot of graphs or you've got a lot of users accessing it.
Can you pay for more, Lee? I seem to remember having read that you can pay for more. But yeah, like it's sort of a cheeky way to make it pay to play, right?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not aware, although potentially the 360 version has an increase.
Yeah.
But for those of us without that, there is a workaround, kind of a workaround with a third-party connector for Looker, such as Supermetrics, which can temporarily store some of your GA4 data. And that reduces the number of GA4 API requests against the quota. Another highly touted solution workaround is what's called a data warehouse, such as BigQuery. This would essentially be a really big database backup of your GA4, and your reports could pull data from the big database instead of directly from GA4. It's a nice workaround, but it, like many things GA4 related, there's a cost benefit. So pulling data from BigQuery means that the number of users can be off. Not always, but it can be. And this is because BigQuery doesn't use Google Signals, and it can't connect sessions to a user in the same way that GA4 can, thanks to Google Signals.
Gotcha. See, I like the idea of data warehouses conceptually because you can pull in your GA4 and you can pull in from different data sources like your ecom platform or your CRM, like different sources, and then sort of prioritize and map out the data and then push that. I think there's sort of some trade-offs there. I certainly think, I've seen it successfully for a lot of larger businesses as well. So, but it does involve, like a lot of this, it does involve some technical savvy, I think. So let's move on. I know, guys, we're at 8:51 for me. So we will be done by 9. We've got about 4 slides left here. So let's talk about standard reports.
Very close. So if a report doesn't exist or doesn't seem to exist, you might still be able to find the data. So for example, we're going to have a look at a demographics report that doesn't seem to exist, but we can click in this overview and all of a sudden we can now see the interests, even though this doesn't appear on the menu on the left.
Gotcha.
So this is available for all of the different overview reports. This is just one example.
It'd be nice if they signposted it a bit better.
Yeah, you could have like all of the different demographic reports down there on that left column, but instead we first go to the overview and then we click through.
Yeah, gotcha.
On the next slide, we'll give you we'll show you how you can apply secondary dimensions and segments. They're just not called segments anymore.
Yeah, this really confused me the first time, like before I did it, because that was my bread and butter, right? Like you go in, secondary dimension filter, you can start looking at sort of campaign performance across channels or whatever you're trying to do. So yeah.
So we're just going to navigate to the traffic acquisition report, and to add a secondary dimension, it's just this little plus button here. We're just going to add the source of the session, and here you can see the data is populated. To add a comparison, there's this button at the top. We're just going to add a device category for desktop, and it's actually a lot quicker than Universal Analytics, and straight away we can see that comparison side by side. Now, a little tip, if you want to see more, if you need a more advanced comparison, so for example, a segment of users who did a sequence, like they did this and then they did that, then you would need to first create an audience and then apply a comparison that contains your new audience, because that would just be too complicated to do in the normal comparisons window.
So that would be the equivalent of creating a segment, right, in Universal Analytics and then playing around with that.
Yeah. In Universal Analytics, like segments and audiences were really similar. So in GA4, they've simplified the new segments, but you still have audiences.
Gotcha.
Now, if you still can't find what you're looking for, you can turn to the explorations section, which is pretty remarkable in the amount of customization. So if you kindly play this for me. So to start with, whilst you can create these from scratch, I highly recommend that you check out some of the templated explorations first, because it will give you the taste of the sort of things that you can do with GA4. For this example, we're going to look at a user behavior exploration. Again, it's loaded up super quickly. We're going to add some customizations here. And then on this report, you can click on the various page paths and expand them. On here, we're seeing how many people have found the GA4 hot potato article from their first homepage visit.
That was Daisy's from the other day, wasn't it?
It was. Now, on the left-hand side, in the first column, this is where you import data, which makes it available to use. Once you've imported that data, you can drag it into the second column, which then places it into the exploration on the right-hand side. You can compare sets of data with comparisons as well. So all in all, it's really powerful, but you do have to get used to it. To succeed with explorations, I recommend that you don't rely on someone else to do it. I mean, it's nice to have someone else who can do it, but have a play around with it yourself and see how you get on. GA4 automatically saves each exploration, so you can easily pick up where you left off. And on that note, I hand back to you, Jake.
So that's awesome, mate. And I'm not going to jump into the reporting bit because you guys have just seen it, and I know we're nearly at time, and I have a client meeting in 5 minutes. So I'm just going to go through. Thank you, everybody. My view on this, honestly, you have made me less skeptical about GA4, because I think that the fact is it's very configurable. You can kind of make it what you want to make it. I do think it's going to be harder for mum and pop shops, like smaller businesses. Like you could whack in your old Universal Analytics and kind of get enough. You need to have more technical savvy to do that. And that's one thing that I'm sort of slightly reticent about. So there are a couple of questions. So to person who asked about alternative tools, as an agency, we haven't used many of them, but the big ones are Matomo. If you're an enterprise business, Adobe Analytics is quite, is well used. My view on Adobe Analytics, I think it's probably better at looking at your web performance than your marketing performance, if you see what I mean. And I think GA does both quite well. I know, so Mike, hello, mate. I know you had asked about attribution models. Yes, we are only going to get data-driven. They think data-driven is better. I disagree with them. If you haven't done anything with GA4, go in. You do need to create a property. There is a wizard tool. In fact, they probably should have set up a GA4 property for you now on your website. So log into analytics, have a look at the events, get started with just getting the sort of basic event set up. If it's something that you don't have a lot of experience with playing around with, I'd probably look at sort of getting, if you're a smaller business, get a freelancer. If you're a bigger business, get an agency who's got some expertise to get it configured correctly for you. Lee, this might be a question for you. Like Danny, hello, mate. So Danny, this isn't a question, but Danny had said on avoiding the API called quotas, there is the Google provided extractor data connector for Looker. So that's also stores the data. Sounds a bit like Supermetrics. Question for you, cool. Lee, is somebody asked, do custom parameters appear in the data layer? That's one for you to, yeah.
not automatically. Custom parameters can pull data out of the data layer and then send it on over to GA4. But if you want that information to be sent to GA4, you could either use something like Tag Manager to identify the data from the website, like directly from the website, or you could have your developers implement that extra data into the data layer for you. Then you would be able to use something like Tag Manager to grab that data from the data layer and pass it on over to GA4. So no, it's not automatically putting stuff in the data layer. It's more like you can take information from the website if it's already there, whether that be from the page or via developers placing it into the data layer. Hopefully that helps.
Cool. And then there was one more question. I know a couple of people had to drop. Somebody was asking if you do have other questions, where best to get in touch. So feel free to, like, LinkedIn is easy, or you can email either us. So I am jake.surrey@fountainpartnership.co.uk. Lee would be lee.sprout@fountainpartnership.co.uk. Obviously, that's a really long email address. You can just add us on LinkedIn. And if you do have additional questions, realistically, if it's a technical question, Lee's going to be better at answering it than I am. But yeah, listen.
You could also, there's also the website, let's not forget. So instead of remembering our names.
Cool. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. And thank you for staying with us. I know there was a lot to take in there. We will be sharing the deck, and there was a recording as well. And again, if you do have additional questions, like Lee is a wizard for this. Like, we have a bunch of really technical people. Yeah, please do feel free to follow up with any questions, and have a delightful afternoon/evening. It's 9 o'clock. I've got to go to a client meeting. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.